We are here tonight to celebrate a great poet and to celebrate the publication of a great book of his poetry in English by our good friends at Farrar Straus, a book called The Poetry of Yehuda Amichai, which is certainly, it's right here, which is certainly now the single most definitive and authoritative volume of Yehuda's poetry in English, edited by our good friend Robert Alter and translated by many hands, some of them on this stage. I will introduce you to our friends on the panel. Sitting next to me is Philip Schultz, a renowned poet and a close friend of Yehuda's. Sitting next to him is Hannah Kronfeld, who teaches Hebrew literature at Berkeley and has just published a significant study of Yehuda's poetry called The Full Severity of Compassion, which can be read almost as a kind of companion to this book. Sitting next to her is the indispensable Robert Alter, who has become, as I say, indispensable both to the literary life of this country and of the American Jewish community. Sitting next to Bob is a person who knew Yehuda quite well, and was married to him for many, many decades, his wife, Hannah Amichai. And sitting next to her is Stanley Moss, poet, publisher, and devoted friend of the Amichais. Our intention tonight is to share some thoughts, some stories about Yehuda, and then to punctuate our conversation with readings from his poems in English and in Hebrew. The riches of this book are very, very great since it encompasses the entirety of Yehuda's career. And I'm going to ask Bob Alter to start off by telling us a little bit about this important book and perhaps introducing our celebration of our friend.
Okay, I have to say that the book was in all senses a labor of love for me. I've loved the poetry since I was in my 20s, and Yehuda and I were dear friends for 34 years from the time I met him in New York in 1966, at which point I was living in New York. Now, he has had a spectacular following in the English-speaking world. I think that there are very few poets writing in languages other than English who have had such a tremendous following. This has to do with the fact that he was a great poet. He also has been fortunate in translators, beginning with Asya Gutman in London very early on, who did some remarkably good translations of some of his early poems. Our Berkeley friend and colleague, Hannah Bloch, who for reasons of health could not be here this evening. Hannah Kronfeld, who's collaborated with Hannah Bloch. So there were some very good things out there which were eminently usable. And I think that Jonathan Galassi, who really conceived this idea, had that in mind, that let's put together these good translations. However, the story is more mixed than that, like most stories. When I went through all the work, first I reread all the poems in Hebrew from beginning to end in chronological order and discovered some really fine poems that had never been translated at all. Then I looked at all the translations of the poems that I wanted to use. In some cases, multiple translations, as many as 3 different translations. And along with the splendid ones, there were ones that made me cringe in one way or another. I will not go into that, but stylistic problems, sometimes egregious misconstructions of the Hebrew. In all those instances of existing poems that did not have usable translations, rather than starting any kind of negotiation with the translators, all of one of whom were still alive, I did my own translations. And then I happily recruited Leon to do a batch of, I think, all entirely untranslated poems. And the 2 Chanas, I'm excluding for the moment the 3rd Chana, who might be, in a way, the most important of the three. The two Chanas collaborated on translating some untranslated poems and retranslating poems, especially rhyming poems. So translating in rhyme is something that's beyond me, and I am amazed at what they did. Let me just add the following, because I'm sure this is going to be mirrored in our conversation in the second part of the program, that Yehuda Amichai was not only a great poet, but he was a dear person. First of all, he was a dear person because he in no way succumbed to the temptation of playing the professional poet. He was just an ordinary guy who had this woman he loved and children he loved, and went shopping in the shuk in Jerusalem, and made jam early in the morning, and in between he wrote poems. So the fact that he was so unpretentious was part of what made him so engaging. He also had a wonderful, at times wicked sense of humor, and you see that in some of the poems. And what seems to me remarkable is there was also a great sadness in Yehuda, which you can see in many of the poems. But the sadness in no way compromised the vivid sense of humor, and in some ways they often work together. But you'll be hearing more about that later. I would like now to ask Hannah Amichai, and for these 4 short poems, Hannah will read them in the Hebrew, and then I will follow each poem by the English translation. The first 3 are my translations, and the 4th one I'm going to be channeling Leon. Okay, schön, Sophie.
The first one is called...
It's on.
The first one is called שיר אינסופי. בתוך מוזיאון חדיש, בית כנסת ישן. בתוך בית הכנסת אני. בתוכי ליבי. בתוך ליבי מוזיאון. בתוך המוזיאון בית כנסת. בתוכו אני. בתוכי ליבי. בתוך ליבי מוזיאון.
Now, the lines are very short, and Hannah beautifully articulated that. Infinite poem. Within the brand new museum, an old synagogue. Within the old synagogue, me. Within me, my heart. Within my heart, a museum. Within it, an old synagogue. Within it, me. Within me, my heart. Within my heart, a museum.
The next one is גשם בשדה קרב. This is one of the very first poems that Yehuda wrote after the War of Independence. And it's in memory of a very close friend who fell in this battle by the name of דיקי. גשם יורד על פני רעי, על פני רעי החיים, אשר מכסים ראשיהם בשמיכה, ועל פני רעי המתים, אשר אינם מכסים עוד.
Rain falls on the faces of my friends, on the faces of my living friends who cover their heads with a blanket, and on the faces of my dead friends who cover no more.
The third poem is God full of mercy, אל מלא רחמים. אל מלא רחמים. אלמלא האל מלא רחמים, היו הרחמים בעולם ולא רק בו. אני, שכתבתי פרחים בהר, והסתכלתי אל כל העמקים. אני, שהבאתי גוויות מן הגבעות, יודע לספר שהעולם ריק מרחמים. אני שהייתי מלך המלח ליד הים, שעמדתי בלי החלטה ליד חלוני, שספרתי צעדי מלאכים, שליבי הרים משקלות כאב בתחרויות הנוראות. אני, שמשתמש רק בחלק קטן מן המילים שבמילון. אני, שמוכרח לפתור חידות בעל כורחי, יודע כי אלמלא האל מלא רחמים, היו הרחמים בעולם ולא רק בו.
As I listened to Hannah's beautiful reading of that poem, I was again painfully reminded of how much you cannot get into a translation. That is, the beginning, which I'll in a moment read in Hebrew, is El Maleh Rachamim, which is, of course, the beginning of the prayer for the dead, and then Ilamale Ha'el Maleh Rachamim, which is a dazzling play on words. God full of mercy, were God not full of mercy, there would be mercy in the world, and not just in him. I who plucked flowers on the mountain and looked in all the valleys, I who hauled from the hills dead bodies, can say that the world is empty of mercy. I who was salt king by the sea, who stood indecisive at my window, who counted the steps of angels, whose heart lifted the weights of pain in the terrible competitions, I, who used just a small part of the words in the dictionary, I, who must solve riddles despite myself, know that were God not full of mercy, there would be mercy in the world, and not just in him.
Poem is I'm a live person. How did you? I am a living man. Okay. אני אדם חי. אני אדם חי. בן אב מת. אבי בן חי. עם הרבה תוכניות של פריחה וקמילה, בדומה לעונות השנה. אני שומע את הקול הצרוד מעט של החיים המלאים האלה. מריח את הריחות הבסומים, המשכמים להורגני. ובימי פסח אלה אני מסב בשכיבה, אולי למות. שם את שעוני על השולחן לפניי, זכר לפנייך. קלות תישבר המצה הפריחה בין אצבעות ידיי. קלות תנוע הדלת בחצי לילה של ניסים, ושאר תאוותי יסמור עוד פעם ובזמן הזה.
I am a living man, son of a dead father, father of a living son, with many plans for blossoming and withering, similar to the seasons of the year. I hear the slightly hoarse voice of this full life. I smell the perfumed odors that rise early to kill me. And in these Passover days, I recline, perhaps to die. I place my watch on the table before me, a remembrance before you. Easily will the brittle matzah break between my fingers. Easily will the door move at the midnight of miracles, and my desires' hair stand on end again and in this time.
I thought that now I might make an observation about Yehuda's, about the full range of his poetry. We've just heard in 2 of the 4 poems something that is really essential to grasping Yehuda, and that is the ubiquity of the Jewish tradition in his poetry. We just heard the El Maleh Rachamim, which is the memorial prayer. We've heard about Passover, the matzah, and so on. Sometimes legends are formed around artists. Sometimes they help to form them, and they interfere with the full appreciation of the artist. So, for example, people think that Robert Frost was a rustic sage, or they think that Haydn was a benign grandfather, or that Oscar Wilde was a supercilious fop. And each of them, there is a legend about Yehuda, part of which is partially true, no question about it, that he revolutionized Hebrew poetry by introducing an Israeli vernacular diction into it, so that the lovers no longer see each other in the light of the moon, but in the light of the refrigerator, in one of his more famous poems. But one of the things that always strikes me about Yehuda's poems, and we just saw this here, is that he's not only a great Israeli poet, he's a great Jewish poet, because the liturgy and the Bible they trip off his tongue naturally, and not just in his late work, where with the last book is virtually a kind of humanistic midrash of some kind, but there is this sense in which he belongs in the line of the great Jewish poets. Having said that, I'll ask a Jewish poet, Mr. Philip Schultz, to read what you want to read of Yehuda's.
Well, this is a love poem. And it's what he does so well. It's called "In the Morning I Stand by Your Bed." It's very small, very, very short poem, very simple and very full of feeling. In the morning I stand by your bed. My shadow falls over your face and deepens your sleep and makes for you extra night. Like a smoker's fingers, our soul has been darkened, addicted to love. I love you with all my might and with all my life. I really can't think of another poet who, in so few lines, could get so much rich, deserved feeling that it's amazing how I feel this poem so deeply. And read another, then. And that was translated by Robert. This is a section from Open, Closed, Open, and my son was drafted. I'm going to read section 1 and section 3. My son was drafted. We brought him to the station along with the other boys. Now his face has joined the faces of those who say goodbye to me from the passing windows of the buses and trains of my life. Faces in the streaming rain, faces squinting in the sun. And now his face in the corner of the window like a stamp on an envelope. I want to give him some advice. Listen, my son, don't change. Remember, thou art what thou art. On a hot day, drink a lot of water. Chug it down and change. And there's the humor, of course. And another piece of advice I remember from my own wars. When you go out for a night patrol, fill your canteen to the top so the water won't make a sloshing sound and give you away. That's how your soul ought to be in your body, large and full and silent. When you make love, make all the noise you want. And don't forget the window in your room that became a window in the bus. At the end of all windows, there's a door. The door giveth, and the door taketh away. And above all, don't forget the wisdom of the folding chair, and the joy of the colorful feathers, the prophecy of the flying white feather, and the vision of an old Italian city where, at the end of tangled alleys, there's always a piazza of sunlight and talk.
Maybe we should tell some stories about Yehuda. Bob mentioned that sublime quality, that rudimentary quality that Yehuda had of being, I don't want to say ordinary, because he was obviously not by any means ordinary, but his gift for commonplace living. And you mentioned how funny he was, and you mentioned that he went to the market a lot, and I have a story that brings it all together. I remember one day Yehuda said, let's go to Machane Yehuda to buy things, and we loaded ourselves up with a lot of plastic baskets. You remember, your kitchen was full of brightly colored plastic baskets. And we bought all the fruit and fish in sight, and they were very heavy. Started walking back from Machane Yehuda, and Yehuda said, let's get a taxi. And I said, fine. So I raised my arm to hail a cab, and I was standing there like this, and Yehuda said to me, that's what's wrong with Jerusalem. And I said, what, you mean that there are no taxis? He said, no, no, no. What's wrong with Jerusalem is that when you raise your hand to hail a cab, you feel like a prophet. That's what he said. And I love that story, not just because it's so funny, but because it also illustrates his incredible racination in his place and the extent to which he experienced. You know, Jerusalem does suffer from a surfeit of meanings. There are just too many meanings in that city. And Yehuda somehow was attuned to all of them, and they all turn up in his poetry. So we finally took a taxi. That's what we did, yes. Tell a story.
Okay. This is a story involving my family. Actually, both the principals in this story, beside Yehuda, are here in the audience. When my son Gabi was 3, I think, maybe 2, and Dadi was a year older, Dadi David, and Dadi's here too. The family was visiting Berkeley, and Yehuda and Hannah and Carol and I were sitting in the dining room eating a decorous lunch, and the 2 little boys were playing in the living room. Now, I have to say that David Amichai, as an adult, is a gentle, even-tempered, really admirable person, but he's a wild little kid. So all of a sudden, we hear a blood-curdling scream and rush into the living room. And our Gabi at the time has had very blonde hair. It's now almost black. And there was Gabi screaming and Dadi with a handful of blonde hair. So the next day, Yehuda and I were driving around together, and we went to pick up my daughter, who has a certain neurological condition that involves falling. So she had to wear a helmet. And Yehuda saw her from a distance, and he said, "What a smart little girl. She's already taken defensive measures against Dadi."
I remember once Yehuda came to Washington to read. He read at the Kennedy Center. And some woman who admired his poetry enormously brought him, for some bizarre reason, presented him with a huge basket on which there were 3 huge sheafs, very long, of artificial wheat. Just kind of presented it like bikurim at the Beit HaMikdash. Just kind of walked up to the poet, laid it at his feet. And Yehuda and I looked at each other, and it was completely clear that if we locked eyes one more time, he would be incapable of completing his reading. And all he did for the entire night, it was one of the worst readings I've ever heard him give, because all he did the whole night was try to avert his gaze from the fake wheat. And it was enormously difficult. And there was some photographer there who took these insane photographs of Yehuda bearing the bikurim out of the Kennedy Center afterward. It was complete dada. It was complete dada.
Now, this woman might have been a secret agent employed by Natan Zaf.
By the competition, yes. By the competition, exactly. And we laughed about the wheat for years and years. I mean, it was...
I have a story. There was a time when we went to Atlantic City. David wanted to go to Atlantic City. And Yehuda somehow enlisted me. I had no desire to go there, and he didn't
You
either.
look like the sort of guy who would know his way around Atlantic City.
I do. Well, I didn't, and we were walking down this boardwalk while David was running in and out of casinos and enjoying himself and getting an eyeful, and we were both becoming progressively more depressed. And it became a competition. I said, I'm so depressed that I can't feel my feet. And he said, in hell, no one can feel their feet. And I said, well, you know, pretty soon I'm going to go to sleep. And he said, well, you have to wake me up when you do. It went on and on and on. And we were staying, believe it or not, at Trump's Taj Mahal. And we got there early because David didn't want to miss a moment. And every time they didn't let us into the room. We were there at 10 or 11, and they didn't let us into the room at 4. So every time we sat down, someone came over and wanted to order a drink. So we had to move from place to place, and finally we sat on the floor just as a show was going on with camels and dancing girls and sword swallowers. And David or I went over to take a closer look, and when I came back, we went together. Yehuda looked at me and said, Philip, I never realized you smell so bad. And I had stepped in camel shit. And they wouldn't let us into the room, and I couldn't go into the bathroom because they charged a lot of money. So it was quite a predicament. And that's Yehuda, is a sense of humor turning gloom into joy.
I'm not going to tell a very funny story, but Yehuda, of course, thought and said that metaphor was the greatest invention since the wheel. That's right. And I remember Yehuda saying to me at a certain time, when metaphor and reality comes together, that's death.
I actually have that in my book. Yeah, he really celebrated metaphor as very much in the same way that Stevens did, even though they're, on egalitarianism, they were on polar opposites. I think there's this sense that for him, metaphor was a way of survival. And I have a personal anecdote that I start my book with, that with your indulgence I will read a little bit of. So this is from The Full Severity of Compassion, the Poetry of Yehuda Amichai, that was published 3 days ago. My first meeting with Yehuda Amichai in the fall of 1970 was what we call in Hebrew a chavaya metakenet, a corrective or healing experience that mends, brings a bit of tikkun to a messy or unpleasant earlier experience. Overeager and all too young, I was trying to put together a series called Pgisha im Sofer, Rendezvous with an Author, for the Israeli educational television, which would, and the series would allow high school students to meet with cutting-edge Hebrew writers in a relaxed roundtable discussion, much like this one, of the writer's work. I was still reeling from a failed attempt to produce the series pilot. An author, who shall remain nameless, whose stories I adored, was so sadistically cruel to the young students that we had to stop the taping. And then it came to me, Yehuda Amichai, of course. Having gotten into the habit of reading his poetry daily for my own emotional sustenance since age 15, I was sure, yes, Amichai would be the one to start with. He would know how to connect with the students and put them at ease. He would be able to talk about the most complex poetic issues with utter simplicity and without egocentric affectation. I had never met him before, but from everything I heard, he was invested, just as Uri was saying, Bob Walter, he was invested in not playing the role of the great poet, even though by 1970 his status as the most revolutionary, indeed the most important poet of the statehood generation of Dor HaMdina had solidified. and he was acquiring an international reputation. He was synonymous with unpretentiousness, and indeed, in his everyman appearance and unaffected manner, Amichai proceeded to treat the students as his equals, joking his way into all our hearts, and thus the series was off to an exciting start. That experience was the beginning of my lifelong friendship with the man and dedication to study and teach the work of the poet.
I might tell one story about it. It suddenly came back to me. It's a very, very fond and bizarre memory. And the very first time I ever translated Yehuda, I was 16 years old, and I was a junior at a yeshiva high school in Brooklyn. But I was very advanced. I was reading Marcuse, and I was very impressive intellectually. And because I was so advanced, I wanted to go to the Vietnam moratorium demonstration in Bryant Park. So wearing my woolen yarmulke, I got on the subway. And I was reading Yehuda Amichai, 1948 to 64, that first book that we all cherished. I had it on my lap, and on West 4th Street, the doors open, and a man sat down next to me. A tall man with glasses kind of tilted on his nose, tousled gray hair. He sat down, and he looked down, and he said, "That's Hebrew poetry, right?" I said, yes. "Who's the poet?" "A poet called Yehuda Amichai. Could you read me a few lines?" I said, "Sure." And I read him probably a love poem from that book. And he said, "Could you translate it?" And so I did my best. I'm sure it was very feeble, but I told him what the literal meaning of the words were, by which point we were at Times Square. And he'd obviously come to the same Vietnam rally, and we both got out, and we then lost each other, went into the crowd, and about 40 or 45 minutes, I'm standing there in the mob listening to the speakers, and they call the next speaker, and the man who had sat next to me gets up to speak, and it was Robert Lowell.
I was hoping that
I'll never forget that.
I was hoping it was going to be Lowell.
Stanley, would you like to read?
Read a poem translated by Robert Alter called "I Want to Mix Up the Bible."
Put the mic.
I think this is better. I'm going to read a poem by Robert Alter called "I Want to Mix Up the Bible." A plane flies over the fig tree, which is over the head of a man under his fig tree. I am the pilot, and I am the man under his fig tree. I want to mix up the Bible. I want so much to mix up the Bible. I believe in trees not as they once believed. My belief is cut short and soon to expire by next spring, by next winter. I believe in the coming of the rain and the setting of the sun. Order and justice are mixed up, good and evil, on the table before me like salt and pepper. The shakers are so alike. I want so much to mix up the Bible. The world is filled with knowledge of good and evil. The world is filled with learning. Birds learn from the blowing wind. The plains learn from the birds, and the sons of man learn from them all and forget. The earth is not sad because the dead are buried within it, and my beloved's dress is not glad that she lives within it. Ararat is a deep valley, and I don't want to go back to my house because all evil tidings come to the house as the book of Job. Abel killed Cain, and Moses entered the promised land, and the children of Israel stayed in the wilderness. I ride in Ezekiel's chariot, and Ezekiel himself dances like Miriam the prophetess in the valley of dry bones. Sodom and Gomorrah are booming, and Lot's wife has turned into a pillar of sugar and honey. And David, king of Israel, is alive and well. I want so much to mix up the Bible. And then I'd like to stall for a minute so you can let the previous poem sink in. Now I've had my minute, so I'll read a poem from Time without, and it has no title, has a number. The diameter of the bomb was 30 centimeters, and the diameter of the effective range about 7 meters. And in it, 4 dead and 11 wounded, and around them, in a greater circle of pain and time, are scattered 2 hospitals and 1 cemetery. But the young woman who was buried where she came from, over 100 kilometers away, enlarges the circle greatly. And the lone man who weeps over her death in a far circle of a distant country includes the whole world in the circle. And I won't speak at all about the crying orphans that reaches to the seat of God, and from there onward, making the circle without end and without God.
Maybe we could talk for a few minutes before Chana reads about the experience of translating Yehuda.
By the way, that last translation was done by somebody called Yehuda Amichai.
Some of his translations are okay. Some of them are really. Yes. I remember for many years, the great Polish poet Miłosz used to threaten to put out an anthology that he wanted to call The Book of Comprehensible Poetry. And, there was a certain anti-intellectual, anti-French bias to it, but I you sort of knew what he meant, that there are some poems that somehow get across the linguistic divide more easily than others. I find that when I translate Yehuda, as I stay with the poem, it gets deeper and thicker and harder and less simple. Absolutely. That's what happens, that you read it and you get it, and then you discover that maybe you didn't get all of it, and then you discover that maybe you didn't get almost any of it the first time. And then you kind of keep digging, and yet, once you've really begun to do this, and you've seen the incredible sophistication of his diction and his metaphor and the games that he plays and the illusions and so on, and yet when you come out the other end, there still is this beautiful, moving, comprehensible poem. And there's some kind of alchemy that he had, and I didn't really discover this as a reader. I discovered it as his translator.
Yeah, this is one of the most vexing issues, because this most translatable of poets is also, as Uri wrote in his introduction, the most untranslatable of poets. And the question is, what gets translated? Yehuda has a wonderful poem in which he describes the process of selecting which texts from the Bible or the Midrash or the Talmud he can accept and which he shouldn't. And it's connected with this desire to mix up the Bible. And he describes it very typically as the work of cooking. It's like putting stuff that you've cooked through a sieve. And if you filter all of this out, if you filter the howl in the gut out of Jeremiah and pain out of Job, what you have left? What you have left is a comprehensible Amichai. But I don't believe, and I write about this, I don't believe that that is not enough, because there is this strange ability for great poetry to continue to do its work, even through these highly filtered sieves and screens. And he's very misleadingly translatable, but what gets through is enough. The problem is that it then gets appropriated into, whatever cultural needs. For example, American Jewish community, now you're all gonna hate me, happen to have. So, you all need a real poet of religiosity. Well, newsflash, El Maleh Rachamim does not qualify him as a religious poet, because what comes after that is Il Maleh El Meleh Rachamim, Hayu Harachamim Ba'olam Velo Rak Bo. If God weren't so stuffed with all the pity in the world, all the compassion in the world, in himself, maybe there'd be some left for us. So, and God becomes very much a literary character for Amichai, who calls this whole business Ha'ani Halo Ma'amin Sheli, my non-credo, but also my I do not believe. So
We untranslated that poem.
So, I think it's really a fascinating issue. I prefer to look at all of these twists that the translation and appropriation creates as blessings. And I think mistranslation is incredibly symptomatic in the Marxist sense. It teaches us a lot about the two cultures, the source and the target culture.
One of the things I began to notice about Yehuda early is that he actually, not only was he not angry or opposed to appropriations, he was deeply grateful every time a poem of his moved somebody or was used by somebody at a wedding. I never saw him respond in a kind of snobbish or nasty, and Yehuda's poems were set to music so many times in
Usually
Israel.
badly.
Well, this is it. Usually badly, and yet when I would sit with Yehuda and listen to a recording, he was moved that someone set his poem to music, and there was a kind of generosity of spirit about it, so that it was almost as if he was creating poems that would be useful for people in their spiritual, private, emotional lives. He was grateful for that.
Yeah, thanks to Hannah Amichai, I discovered 2 days ago a YouTube of a 1972 program that I did with Yehuda as part of a series I did for the television in Israel on the ballad, and we set Habalada ala se'ara aruch v'se'ara katzer, the ballad on the short hair and the long hair, to music, and as part of the pedagogical exercise, divided the dramatic dialogue from the descriptive, and he was joking about how this is not what he had in mind, but was incredibly open, just as you said, and he talks about translations really belonging to the translator. He only advises us to push the language beyond the comfort zone of the target language. So make English uncomfortable, make it serve and reflect the Hebrew.
Just a couple of things. There were, I found when I worked on the book, some poems that seemed entirely transmissible in English. I think this is the exception rather than the rule, but there are some such. For example, a rather famous, wonderful poem called Jacob and the Angel is a poem about a one-night stand. You infer from reading the poem it's a woman that the speaker has picked up on the beach. And he doesn't ask her name, just as in the story of Jacob and the Angel. Now, this is a famous story from Genesis, which probably most readers would recall. There's nothing in the language of the poem even vaguely reminiscent of the story.
I don't agree.
It's colloquial. There are bits of kids' language, and it works beautifully in English. You can follow it. On the other hand, as Leon was saying, Hannah too, there's so much that's layered, where he's playing with many of the strata of the Hebrew language, and there's also a terrific amount of sound play, word play, puns, most of which you cannot get into English, although the two Hannahs, I think, often did a very good job with this in that last volume of Yehuda's. But I would also underwrite what both Leon and Hannah said, that amazingly something gets through. And I'll give you an example. There are two poems that I translated, but one of which had never been translated, the other had been translated several times, which are written in rhyming stanzas. And I decided I really can't do the rhyme. And that if I try to make it rhyme, I'm going to distort the wonderful imagery of the poem. So I did this blatant violation of the original poem. In both instances, I translated without rhyme, although I tried to give a certain musicality to my English version, and I think a good deal of it amazingly comes through.
Just to complicate things, even when it seems like everything works so perfectly, because we all know that Jacob fought with a male angel and so forth, and it's not a one-night stand with a woman. The Hebrew reader, especially at the time, can find in the poem a sustained allusion to a very sappy song from the 1956 campaign, the Mifza Sinai, Hu lo yada et shma, where
He didn't know her name.
he didn't know her name, and the whole story about their love affair before she ends up taking care of him as he lies dying in battle. And that whole thing gets twisted into the birth narrative of the Jewish nation, right, which is that encounter.
I have to go back and reread that story. It's getting more interesting. Yes.
Right. Of course, there's some question as to what makes a poet. Right? And although the SS knew their Goethe pretty well, and the head of the university at Würzburg burned the synagogue down, Yehuda's grandmother read him Goethe. Now, my Bubba didn't read me Whitman and didn't read me the Bible. And the influence of his grandmother reading him Goethe, and within the family, there was a lot of poetry early on. And of course, that other people read Goethe and weren't Yehuda, but that little relationship with his grandmother reading him Goethe couldn't have done him any harm.
I remember once I was looking at Yehuda's library and was startled to discover the first edition from 1923 of Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus. And I thought that was rather unexpected in Yamin Moshe, but there it was.
And then there's the fact that bang el boomo, explosion in the desert when at El Alamein, and he picks up a volume of W.H. Auden.
Yeah. Hannah, you want to read?
Didn't make him a poet,
Yeah,
sure.
and this really has a lot to do with why we're here. Just like Stanley was saying, there is this underlying humanity that is the reason that I chose the title of my book, From the Poem to the Full Severity of Compassion, which Hannah Bloch and I translated for Bob Alter's volume. And it's a strange kind of portmanteau, right? A mixture of two opposing principles in Jewish ethics. One is, that you need to prosecute somebody to the full severity or the full extent of the law. And then taking this word for severity out, which is chumra, and replacing it with a word that means everything for Amichai, and he uses it again and again. And it's rachamim, it's the same root, he reminds us, just in different orders. And in another poem, he says, God needs to be reminded that rachamim, compassion or mercy, comes from rechem, from womb. This commitment to treat compassion with the same rigor that we treat the law, the letter of the law, that we're quick to judge and condemn, is really important to Amichai. And he calls into question here the divine promise to Abraham to make his offspring as countless as the sand on the seashore and as numerous as the stars in the sky. And he links it, the counting, not to the blessing, but to the writing of the wall, on the wall in Daniel. So I think this command to count the suffering people, to recount what Walter Benjamin has described as the history of the vanquished, and to resist the promise and false hope in the name of which they are asked again and again to sacrifice. This, for me, al regel achat, on one foot, is the central principle of Amichai's poetic ethos, an ethos that he, those of us who know him have heard him many times refer to as humanism ha-post-tzini sheli, my post-cynical humanism. And so here is the title poem. I'll read it in English first. To the full severity of compassion. Count them. Yes, you can count them. They are not like the sand upon the seashore. They are not like the stars of the heaven for multitude. They're like lonely people on the corner and in the street. Count them. See them seeing the sky through ruined houses. Find a way out of the stones and come back. What will you come back to? But count them. For they do their time in dreams, and they walk around outside, and their hopes unbandaged are gaping, and they will die of them. Count them. Too soon have they learned to read the terrible handwriting on the wall, to read and write upon other walls, and the feast goes on in silence. Count them. Be present, for they have already used up all the blood, and there's still not enough. As in a dangerous operation, when one is exhausted and beaten down like 10,000. For who's judge and what's judgment, unless it be to the full extent of night and the full severity of compassion. בכל חומרת הרחמים. מנה אותם. אתה יכול למנות אותם. הם אינם כחול אשר על שפת הים. הם אינם ככוכבים לרוב. הם כאנשים בודדים בפינה וברחוב. מנה אותם. ראה אותם רואים את השמיים דרך בתים הרוסים. צא מן האבנים וחזור. לאן תחזור? אבל מנה אותם, כי הם מרצים את ימיהם בחלומות, והם מהלכים בחוץ, ותקוותיהם שלא נכבשו הן פעורות, ובהן ימותו. מנה אותם. מוקדם מדי למדו לקרוא את הכתב הנורא על הקיר, לקרוא ולכתוב על קירות אחרים, והמשתה נמשך בדממה. מנה אותם. היה נוכח, כי הם כבר השתמשו בכל הדם ועדיין חסר, כמו בניתוח מסוכן כשאחד הוא עייף ומוכה כרבבה. כי מי דן ומה דין, אלא במלוא מובן הלילה ובכל חומרת הרחמים. With your permission, I want to read a poem for Emanuela that that Hannah Bloch was supposed to read on Monday, but she couldn't be there. And this is a poem that Hannah Bloch translated. And I'll just read it in English. On the day my daughter was born, no one died. The first stanza is poetry, the second is prose. On the day, and Emanuela is here, and this is for you. On the day my daughter was born, not a single person died in the hospital, and at the entrance gate, the sign said, "Today, Kohanim are permitted to enter." And it was the longest day of the year. In my great joy, I drove with my friend to the hills of Sha'ar Hagai. We saw a bare, sick pine tree, nothing on it but a lot of pine cones. Tzvi said, "Trees that are about to die produce more pine cones than healthy trees." And I said to him, "That was a poem, and you didn't realize it. Even though you're a man of the exact sciences, you've made a poem." And he answered, "And you, though you're a man of dreams, have made an exact little girl with all the exact instruments for her life." Your Abba would be very proud of you, Emanuela.
I think before we're going to conclude with poems. I will read one, and then after that we will have the special joy of hearing Yehuda read one in English and in Hebrew so that you're left with the music of his voice. Before I read this poem, I want to implore you all not just to buy this book, but to keep it close to you. Because if you do keep it close to you, you will make an extraordinary friend. I promise you that. This is a poem that was published in 1983 in a volume called Sha'at HaChesed, The Hour of Grace. A man in his life has no time to have a season for everything. He has no time for every purpose. Ecclesiastes was wrong when he said so. A man must hate and love all at once. With the same eyes he must cry and laugh. With the same hands cast away stones and gather stones together. In war he must make love, and in love he must make war. And hate and forgive, and remember and forget, and order and disorder, and eat and digest what a long history does over many, many years. A man in his life has no time. When he loses, he seeks. When he finds, he forgets. When he forgets, he loves. And when he loves, he begins to forget. His soul is wised up. His soul is a professional. Only his body is forever an amateur, trying and fumbling, never learning, always confused, drunk and blind in pleasures and in pains. He will die the death of a fig in autumn, shriveled and filled with himself and sweet, as the leaves are drying on the ground and the naked branches are already pointing to the place where there is a time for everything. Adam b'chayav ein lo zman sheyeh lo zman lakol, ve'en lo et shetiyeh lo et lechol chefetz. Kohelet lo tzadak kshe'amar kach. Adam tzarich lisno v'le'ehov bevat achat, be'otan einayim livkot uve'otan einayim litzchok. באותן ידיים לזרוק אבנים ובאותן ידיים לאסוף אותן. לעשות אהבה במלחמה ומלחמה באהבה. ולשנוא ולסלוח ולזכור ולשכוח ולסדר ולבלבל ולאכול ולעכל את מה שהיסטוריה ארוכה עושה בשנים רבות מאוד. אדם בחייו אין לו זמן. כשהוא מאבד הוא מחפש, כשהוא מוצא הוא שוכח, כשהוא שוכח הוא אוהב, וכשהוא אוהב הוא מתחיל לשכוח. ונפשו למודה, ונפשו מקצועית מאוד. רק גופו נשאר חובב תמיד, מנסה וטועה, לא לומד ומתבלבל, שיכור ועיוור, בתענוגיו ובמכאוביו. מות תאנים ימות בסתיו, מצומק ומלא עצמו ומתוק. העלים מתייבשים על האדמה, והענפים הערומים כבר מצביעים אל המקום שבו זמן לכל. And now we'll hear from Yehuda himself, I believe. There should be a recording.
God has pity on kindergarten children, less on school children, and on grown-ups he won't take pity anymore. He leaves them alone, and sometimes have to crawl on all fours in the blazing sand to get to the first aid station dripping blood. Maybe he will take pity and cast his shadow on those who truly love, as a tree on someone sleeping on the bench on a boulevard. Maybe we too will spend on them the last rare coins of favor Mother bequeathed us, so their bliss will protect us now and in other days. אלוהים מרחם על ילדי הגן, פחות מזה על ילדי בית הספר, ועל הגדולים לא ירחם עוד, ישאירם לבדם, ולפעמים יצטרכו לזחול על 4 בחול הלוהט כדי להגיע לתחנת האיסוף, והם שותי דם. אולי על האוהבים באמת ייתן רחמים ויחוס ויצל, כאילנה לישן בספסל בסתירה הציבורית. אולי להם גם אנחנו ניתן את מטבעות החסד האחרונות שהורישה לנו אמא, כדי שאושרם יגן עלינו עכשיו ובימים האחרים.
Thank you all for coming.